Okay, so what I was planning to cover today was kind of a bit of a journey from some experiences I've had working with customers implementing these things called event-driven architectures and some of the lessons I've learned, and kind of segueing from that into this idea of external event APIs. So event APIs as digital products. So I'm not sure how aware people are of this idea of kind of digital products, APIs as products. Everybody heard this idea? Good. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit how we can help enable those two. All right, let's get started. So some lessons learned from implementing EDAs. Just a rough bag of things I've learned that have been really important talking to customers. Okay. That thing over there on the far left-hand side is apparently called a magic bullet. I had to Google that, and that's the answer I got in terms of an image. Yeah, event-driven architectures are not magic bullets. There's a lot of hype around EDA at the moment. It's really hot. I think there's a danger. I've seen this at customers where people tend to think of them as being able to solve everything. It's that whole thing of when you've got a hammer in your hand, everything looks like a nail. Event-driven architectures aren't going to solve everything. What they are going to help you with are kind of challenges where you have to do anything in real time, so maybe your dashboarding information, that kind of thing. It's also a good indication if you've got an architectural approach that you've tried before and kind of hit some challenges around response times or excessive resource consumption, that kind of thing. So let me give you an example. If you look at what Unilever do, obviously they're shipping raw materials and products all around the world, right? So they've got something like 1,500 containers in motion at any one time on something like 400 different ships. And what they needed to do, especially around kind of the pandemic, when the pandemic struck, they had to restructure a lot of their supply chains almost on the fly. Classic example being, you're moving from manufacturing things like flour, for instance, bags of flour. You're sending that off to a mixture of supermarkets and bakeries, and all of a sudden all the bakeries are shut and everybody wants to bake at home. So you've got to change your supply chain to make 1 kilo bags of flour rather than 25 kilo bags of flour, right? Same amount of product, but just you need to completely change your supply chain around. So how do you keep track of all of those 1,500 containers on those 400 ships? Well, you could do it in a kind of batched API kind of way, kind of polling various applications to find out where everything is. But if you're having to do that, 1,500 times, it's going to cause a lot of strain on those systems. So what they did is they implemented this thing called a virtual oceans control tower, and they did that in an event-driven way. So when there is an update of interest on a ship or a container, so this ship's got stuck in the Suez Canal. Yeah, that'll never happen. Turns out it did. Emitting those as events, so these containers are now delayed, enabled them to react to those events in terms of what they needed to do in their supply chain as they happened, rather than looking at, say, a batch-based approach where they're constantly polling for that information. Right? So that's a good example of where an event-driven architecture can really help. Another example is where you're augmenting existing architecture. So anybody here kind of using API kind of led design practices? You're doing REST APIs? Okay, so there's a danger, I think, in the market of kind of event-driven architectures as being something that might replace that, or is something completely orthogonal to that, right? In Solus, we don't believe that that's the case. We think event-driven architectures should be used as an augmentation to some of these existing architectural approaches. So for instance, if you have an API gateway, wouldn't it be really nice to plug that into your event-driven architecture so you can take some of the things that are happening in your REST API world and use them as events? Really simple example of that is you've got a customer-facing e-commerce site, something like that. There's loads of REST requests going in there. Wouldn't it be nice to kind of ingest those interactions as events without having to make that separate API calls or add extra layers to your API gateway? Right? So another kind of, this is the real classic kind of use case for event-driven architecture, of course, is the whole cloud microservices type approach, right? You might be doing something like event sourcing, where you've got your kind of polyglot persistence model. That's an excellent example of where event-driven architectures can help. The danger with that we feel in Solace is that you tend to see them end up as kind of event-driven islands. So you've got these little greenfield projects where you've deployed microservices, but you still have to interact with all your legacy systems, right? So having an event-driven architecture that gives you that capability helps to break down those event-driven islands, because one of the real benefits of event-driven architectures is this ability to break down data silos, right? But you're only going to be able to do this if you can hook into your existing lines of business and the systems they're using. So key feature of what we want to do with our event-driven architecture, right, is have it able to evolve as your business evolves. It's very simple to see these things. You know, you do a big POC, that's great. You build up a load of experience around your event-driven architecture, but it's going to change, right, as your business changes. So naming conventions, right, everybody knows about naming conventions, a bit dull, but just from an event-driven architecture point of view, there are some different ways of thinking about things that I feel are important. One of those is around this idea of looking at events as kind of generic business process-orientated assets, right? So it's tempting to think about things as like systems. We're hooking systems together. The classic one, of course, being if we talk about ERP, everybody's going to think SAP ECC. So it's tempting to put things like ECC in your event name or your event topic. That's not how we like things to be done. Again, your architecture is going to evolve. At some point, you're going to have to move to something like HANA. So we want to talk about things as in a generic sense. So talk about the business process. Don't talk about an organizational kind of boundary, like this is the supply team or this is the master data team or anything like that. Talk about them as kind of generic business processes. Now, one of the things we do in Solace is we have this idea of producing to a topic and consuming from a persistence object, which is in the Solace case is a queue. So in the PubSub Plus broker, our topics are dynamic and they're hierarchical. And we believe this is a real key to this idea of evolving your architecture with your business. And it's a real enabler of agility too. So the problem with having something that's kind of this dynamic is that it's easy to lose track of what you're doing with it. So the way we deal with that is we have this idea of a topic taxonomy, which is an architecture for how you define these topics. If you get that right, and it's just a structure, you're not defining the topics yourself, you're defining the structure they follow. If you get that right, these topics will evolve with your architecture. And what we like to see is something like this that we define at the start of a project is still being used kind of 5-10 years later in people's architectures, and we see that. So topic taxonomy is kind of key to us. That's like a naming convention almost for topics. If you want to know more, a colleague of mine, Ken Barr, wrote an excellent article on how this should be done. And actually, when we engage with customers, sometimes we kind of run a professional services engagement, which we call Becoming Event Driven. And one of the first things we do is help them draw up this topic taxonomy. On a more prosaic level, I mentioned this idea of producing to a topic and then consuming for a queue. We in Solace were quite opinionated about this. We think queues, your standard message queuing approach, is the simplest, easiest to understand, and least error-prone way of enabling persistence. So queue naming, the queue is a kind of per consumer object. So you can create queues on the fly and have them subscribe to event streams. So it's a per consumer object. So reflect that the queue is to do with your consumer and not to do with the producer of the data. And again, keep it generic, right? So talk about what kind of data you're expecting people to consume, right? Okay. Good. All right. So I talked about this idea of the queue as your kind of persistence object, as your kind of consumer entry to your event-driven architecture, okay? There's a couple of points to bear in mind here. There's a few broad event-driven styles. One of those is the notification style, okay? So SAP are big on this. Something has changed. That's all it says. Something has changed. So probably what you're going to do is you're going to make another call out to the platform that emitted that event, right? So SAP like this because it ties in quite closely to their governance model. Now, do they have to be persisted? Probably not, right? Probably something like a best effort kind of method of transmission is probably good. It's probably not much useful persisting an event that something has changed if you've got another 4, this same thing has changed coming after it, right? If you're using something like a microservices architecture where you're probably transmitting state changes, you're doing a state transfer event, absolutely, that's got to be persisted, right? So when you're doing that persistence there, the key thing about it is that you shouldn't notify anyone that that persistence is now no longer useful until that has actually happened. So what I mean by that is it's very tempting sometimes for people to say, I've got that event, good, I'm dealing with it now. We see that as the wrong way of doing things. You should only say, I've finished with this event when you actually are finished, when you've finished processing it, okay? Now, the advantage of a queue-based architecture is that it's very simple. You then just send an acknowledgement. And that will mean that the item is removed from the queue, so it's no longer there. So let me give an example of that. There's a large software vendor. They have a transportation management application. And fortunately, it's got a REST interface. That's great for us at Solus. We have REST interfaces too, natively built into the product. And so off we send to them, we want to move something. We've finished a production order. Let's start moving that item around. And what this application does is it says, I've got your REST request. Everything's good. Great, except there's one minor problem. And that is if your request is malformed, it'll say, I've got your request. Oh, by the way, there's a problem with it. That's a bit late by then, right? Because you're thinking, well, you've dealt with it. I've given you the event. I've dealt with it. It's time to move on. So that's kind of a key illustration of why you shouldn't acknowledge something until it's actually finished processing and you're sure you've got it. Error handling is obviously a key one here. So in this example of the malformed payload, what should you do? Well, you should drop it off to something like a dead message queue for later evaluation. You could chuck it off to an S3 bucket or something in the cloud, something like that. But just have a method there of moving this malformed thing off somewhere useful. In the Solus platform, we've got lots of great features to help with that. We've got this thing called last value queues, which are really handy for producers to understand where they've got to in an event flow when they reconnect after a failure, right, for example. Okay. You don't want to be at the end of that blue arrow, right? Fairly standard stuff. Make sure you log it. Make sure the producer logs it before it sends it. Make sure the consumer logs it when it gets it before it does anything with it. Log aggregation is really handy here. So I think the previous session was a guy from, was it Splunk? I can't remember, but these kind of tools can be really helpful. In an event-driven architecture, the whole point of this architecture is that it's publish, subscribe, right? So that we can send everything that's going through the platform wherever it needs to go without breaking any of our existing conversations. So we can just add log aggregation in really easily. It's just a matter of adding another subscriber, right? So it's really easy to do that. One of the funky features of the PubSub Plus platform is we've got native interfaces to most of these cloud vendor services, right? So I've got a customer that's very simply, every event that passes through the platform, they just upload it to an S3 bucket. And that way, if there's any questions about it at all, let's go and have a look. Really simple. That makes it easy. Just a bit of a teaser. This is a bit cruel, but I do like doing this. Wouldn't it be really nice if you could use something like OpenTelemetry, the OpenTelemetry standard, and some of those open source tools to have a look at all of your event flows? Exactly where has an event been? Be really nice. Watch this space. We should have something in that space soon, right? Okay. Last one on these kind of observations from dealing with customers building event-driven architectures is the design phase, right? I like to think of this as these events that we're building here, they're business assets, right? They carry value, otherwise we wouldn't be dealing with them. If you can imagine something like I'm making, I don't know, I'm an e-commerce site and I'm sending a notification to my fulfillment partner that they need to pick up the product and ship it to the customer. You think about it, that's almost the entire value of your business encapsulated as a single event there. Well, assets, like every other asset, have life cycles. They need to be tracked. So it's not just, they don't just pop into existence and then disappear again. We need to understand some things about this asset. Whose is it? Who's responsible for it? What does it really mean? And what I've noticed in some of my customers is, there's an initial use case is decided upon. There's a POC that starts up. There's a small kind of core team of people, the EDA ninjas that get involved and start building up this POC, and hopefully it's successful. And then they kind of end up going back to their day jobs, right? And what that often means is all that expertise around the use case and the tooling that's been built in tends to get a bit diluted. And that initial POC use case tends to languish a little bit and get a bit forgotten about, and nobody touches it, right? So what we're talking about here is how are we going to build the tooling that's going to capture this kind of design time asset view of our events, right? We did a survey and we found that something like 75% to 3/4 of people don't feel that there's sufficient tooling around EDA really to be able to build up this kind of knowledge. So we need some tooling to capture this knowledge and help teams communicate about it and distribute it, right? And that leads rather nicely into, do you see what I've done there? A segue into this whole idea. Oh, good, I got a smile. I didn't get any smiles yesterday. A segue into this whole idea of tooling around EDA. So how are we going to capture design intent, for instance? Okay, so brief marketing slide. Skip over this. You're looking for lunch. Lots of customers, because they've been doing EDA for years. We've been in the financial services industry for 20 years. Market data, those stock ticks, that's probably the first broad universal event-driven architecture, right? And they're very good at building like spreadsheets to track the events. And we write Confluence pages that describe design intent, but it's all in different places. It's using tools that aren't really built for this. So the idea is if we build some custom tooling, we should take all that effort away of kind of building and maintaining this kind of ad hoc tooling that you've got around this. And if we do that, hopefully what we'll get is this idea of collaboration. So architects can talk to solution architects about what their design should do, can talk to developers about the individual bits of code or integrations that they're doing. Once we've got all of that captured in the platform, we can start looking at what do we do about governance? Who should access what events? How could we share events across organizational boundaries? That kind of thing. So is there an approach we can borrow from? Well, fortunately, we think there is. If you look at the kind of API vendor space, they've got their API gateways, but what they did a really good job of, and this is one of the reasons why kind of this API space was so successful, was building these API portals on top of the API gateways. And they give you marketplaces where you can share information about these APIs, right? You can probe into the runtime and find out what you've already got existing on your platform. So what about the event-driven space? Well, there are plenty of event brokers out there. They act as the runtime. Well, could we just borrow the idea and build an event portal on the top? And that's basically exactly what we've done at Solace. So we've built this, what we call event portal, and it does all of the things that you would expect it to do. It can probe into the runtime and find out what your existing event streams are. It enables you to capture documentation about a specific event, that kind of thing. So here it is. Here's one of the initial screenshots. This is kind of often your entry into Event Portal, the kind of design view. So you're going to draw up your applications and how the events flow between the applications. You can see here that actually we've got, we've got probes into, for instance, if you're using Kafka anywhere, we've got probes into Kafka to find out what the runtime events in Kafka are. By the way, we don't see this as a Solid-specific tool. We're kind of looking at this as a portal that can be used with just about any event broker. So we can draw up our applications and draw up the event flows between them. Once we've done that, of course, we can start cataloging what events we've got. Once we've got that catalog, we can dive into that catalog. We can annotate design information into it. We can share how people can access these particular events. So I'm going to just change direction just slightly here. So I don't know how many of you are kind of aware of the kind of Gartner model of the composable business capability. Not seeing a lot of recognition. Okay, so what they see is Gartner see that events are going to become an important part of your applications. So they're moving on this kind of view of a subsystem or as a system as something that just has perhaps a GUI and perhaps some APIs to something that also exposes event channels. And they're taking that concept a bit further to the point where, well, these event channels, in much the same way as kind of in our API-driven economy, right? We can sell APIs as products. We can do that with these events too. And that leads on to this idea of external event APIs, right? Event APIs as a digital product. So let's have a look at how that looks in practice. So if you have events that are of very high value, the chance is that they're going to be consumed by multiple applications across multiple elements in the business. So let's have a look at an e-commerce system, for instance. Everybody uses those as an example. So in our e-commerce platform, we've got an order management system, right? I place an order, that will keep track of it, and we can emit an event as I've received an order. We're probably, hopefully, going to take some payment off the customer, and so then we're going to wait to ship it, and then we're going to ship it, right? These are some of the kind of common events we might have. We might have a warehouse system where we're going to talk about what stock has been allocated. We can emit that as an event, right? There might be a new product available, or maybe it's an existing product that has been out of stock and we've got new stock available that's just come in. We've got our product catalog. Maybe there's new products that we're trying to sell, hot new products we want to sell lots of. So as and when that is exactly available, we want to emit an event saying, buy. And we probably want to interact with our marketing teams. They're going to want to run promotions. They're going to want to run their bog-offs, that kind of thing. And probably the launch dates are probably quite well contained, right? So we want to be able to update everybody as and when that promotion goes live. So we've got quite a catalog of events here. And we could look at them as a kind of per system kind of bundle, right? We could talk about order management events. But if you think about how these things are going to be consumed, that doesn't actually make sense from that point of view. So if you look at, say, somebody trying to interact with a delivery service provider, so your DHLs, your FedExes of the world, they not only need to know about an order when it's been created and when they should ship it, but they probably want to know when stock is available and the shipment is likely to happen, right? What about inventory management? So we not only need to know about the stock levels, but if a new product is available, we need to know about that too. We need to allocate space within our inventory management system. What about if we're interacting with price comparison tools? If we're launching a new product or we've started a promotion, they're probably going to want to know about that too. So you can see that if you think about it from a kind of application point of view, actually, we're going to need multiple events from multiple different locations, as you'd expect in a publish-subscribe system. But how are we going to express that? How are we going to distribute that knowledge? Right? So this is kind of the idea behind an event API product. It's a bundle of events related to a particular business activity. So you want to consume that as a whole, right? If I'm FedEx or DHL and I want to know when I'm going to ship an order, I need to know all of those events related to that. That's not only order management, but it's things like cataloging and things like that. What this enables you to do from your point of view is able to bundle those up and select those events ready for whoever's going to consume them. That could be a line of business within your organization or an external party. And of course, as the customer needs change, maybe you're bringing in new events, you can update your event products as a kind of separate member of this event-driven asset kind of view of things. And we kind of talked about how this works, right? So you may have an order status product that bundles up all the events that are related to that order status, and that may be particularly useful for your DHLs and FedExes of the world, right? Okay, that's enough on that, I think. So how are we actually going to do this? Well, if you look back to our, catalog view here, really all we're doing is selecting different events from this catalog that we want to expose to our third party. The only other things we need to do, I'll tell that other party whether you're going to receive those events or whether I'm expecting them from you, and coming up with a way of exposing this view of the events to that third party. So fortunately, we now have a way of doing that. So in our event portal, you just go to our event product tab, and that gives you a kind of catalog view of the events. You create a new product, select the events you want and which direction you expect them to go. That's great. We've now got a product view of our event API, but we're missing one last stage, and that is how do we communicate that with external people? Well, fortunately, there's an open standard in this space. It's called Async API. I don't know if anybody's heard of Async API. Yeah, good. Okay. So that is a really good way of communicating your event API product. So great. So we can just, there's a button up there, download it. You can just download the Async API specification of your event product. Great. But that's not like we're kind of all event-driven here. That's not the way we want to do things. We don't want to be sending specifications around on email. Let's not do that. That's not very event-driven. So why not have an API you can call that will give you the current state of that event product as an async API spec? Great. Well, do even better for that. We'll actually host it for you on our website if you want. So your third party can just go and see that the specification in whatever form they need. There you go. That's very good timing, because I've kind of come to the end point now. So hope you find that useful. As I say, remember, if you want to see some of these things around, for instance, topic taxonomy or more detailed demos about Event Portal, please do, because I did one of the demos. Remember the QR code on the cards on the seats next to you. And also, our stand is just outside there. You can't miss it, so please come and talk to us. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much.